Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at Pacifism as Pathology, Reflections on the Role of Armed Struggle in North America, by Churchill, AK Press, 2007. The key idea of this text is that if analyzed critically, modern white American pacifism is ineffective for creating change. The text argues that modern pacifism should be seen as a cop-out, because it claims to want change, yet acts in a way that incurs the least amount of sacrifice or harm as possible to those ends. The text argues that if you take what has been protested against, racism within the U.S., war, poverty, death, starvation, deprivation of people in the third world, and compare that to the mode of protest, carrying a sign peaceably until the police tell you to go home, modern pacifism seems to be a very pathetic attempt at solidarity with those facing oppression. Let's take a look at the text in depth. First, let's look at the 2007 preface by Derrick Jensen. Derrick Jensen starts by giving an overview of the book, stating, "This book, more than any other, demystifies and deconstructs dogmatic pacifism, shows it for what it really is." This is an interesting claim because I thought that Derrick Jensen's own book, Endgame, which was written a year before, was supposed to fit that description. Derrick continues. He continues with quotes about how incredible Native American culture was, and facts about our gargantuan military budget and how that could be used for better things, essentially laying out potential goals for a better world and what is so corrupt and unjust about the world currently. Derrick then goes a little into his personal life, shedding light on how his beliefs were formed, stating, "It took me years to learn this very important lesson. You cannot argue with an abuser. You will always lose. In fact, you've lost once you begin." This point has been made by several thinkers, those who argue for reframing the debate, such as George Lakoff, and those who argue for decolonizing our hearts and minds, such as Churchill. The point is that if you try to argue rationally with someone unwilling to meet you in rational debate, your points can be confused and manipulated by the unquestioned assumptions and false premises of the dominant narrative. As the saying goes, it's hard for a man to understand you when his pay is based on not understanding you. Derrick then gives one of his main points from Endgame, stating, "The Jews who participated in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, including those who went on what they thought were suicide missions, had a higher rate of survival than those who went along." Meaning, not only is it better to die on your feet than on your knees, but on your feet you might just survive. In a debate between Derrick Jensen and Chris Hedges discussing this topic, they came to the conclusion that it's unfair to ask so much of everyone, that what people have and can lose is a very important determinant in asking what they're capable of. But it still remains a powerful observation. Derrick then spends the next several pages naming what he calls articles of faith, which is much like him laying out the fallacies of nonviolent arguments in his book Endgame, such as pacifists tell us that by wanting to fight back we're being dualistic, or that violence begets violence, etc., etc. Most of the counter-arguments are based on deconstructing the pacifist arguments and finding problems in their implications. Because I'm focusing on Ward's work, I won't go into Derrick Jensen's counter-arguments here, but if you're interested, you can check out his lectures on the book Endgame, or for more in-depth explanations, I would recommend getting the Endgame books themselves. Derrick closes by quoting Ward, who states, "There is not a petition campaign that you can construct that is going to cause the power and the status quo to dissipate. It will not be a painless process. But hey, newsflash, it is not a painless process now. If you feel a relative absence of pain, that is testimony only to your position of privilege within the status structure. This means that it is immoral to claim the moral high ground by clinging to ineffective pacifism while bombs are dropped and people are dying of starvation." Derrick rephrases the argument in this way: "Choosing inaction or ineffective action in the face of exploitation or abuse is about as impure an action as anyone can conceptualize." Now let's look at the 1988 edition preface by Ed Mead. Ed's main argument is that nonviolence is a tactical question, not a strategic one, essentially arguing that to use pacifism as a strategy regardless of situation is foolish, but to use it tactically, situation to situation, is smart. If people are rounding up and shooting everyone with a picket sign, then nonviolence seems like a foolish tactic. But if people ordered to shoot protesters are refusing to shoot friends and relatives and are instead standing in solidarity with them, then violence would be a foolish tactic. Chris Hedges has made this distinction when explaining his experiences with armed forces who were willing to kill in Sarajevo and armed forces that were unwilling to kill during the fall of the Berlin Wall. Introduction: Pacifism as Pathology, Revisited, Excavating a Debate with Ward Churchill. In referencing some classes that he taught, Ward explains, "The premise underlying my session was that many people on the left demonstrated an irrational aversion to firearms based upon abject ignorance of, and consequently intimidation by, the technology itself." It's a bizarre but thought-provoking claim. Whether or not you use violence, it is important to understand the functions and mechanisms of the various weapons used against you. It is a poor strategy to purposefully not understand the weapons your enemy uses against you. Pacifism as Pathology, Notes on an American Pseudo-Praxis by Ward Churchill. Here, essentially, Ward lays out how modern nonviolent protests has had little to no effect on bringing about change and so needs to be re-examined. This section reminds me of Chris Hedges, who has argued that the state's response to the Occupy movement could have been student loan forgiveness, housing programs, raising the minimum wage, etc., which would have quietly made the movement disappear. But instead, the state responded with widespread violence, thus showing a complete bankruptcy on rational response to pacifist protest. Like lambs to the slaughter. Here Ward expresses, A, that he doesn't want to be seen as anti-Semitic for claiming that many of those killed in the Holocaust didn't sufficiently fight back, and also B, give cases of concentration camp revolts and explain that the agitators of pacifist revolts and the agitators of violent revolts and those who didn't participate at all pretty much died the same. But those who violently revolted at least actually caused damage to those who were destroying them. The argument is given again, it's better to die on your feet than on your knees. This section has many lengthy quotes from conservative commentator and former concentration camp inmate Bruno Bettelheim, who is also arguing these points. An essential contradiction. Ward starts this section by defining pacifism and its purpose. The proponents of nonviolent political praxis are inherently placed in a position of claiming to meet the armed might of the state via an assertion of moral superiority attached to the renunciation of arms and physical violence altogether. Essentially, that everyone will see how right you are and how corrupt the state is when the state beats and pepper sprays, tear gases, and water cannons you, and you respond with calm, nonviolent resolution a la Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi. Ward then attempts to put the fire to Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., explaining that the Gandhian success must be viewed in the context of a general decline in British power brought about by 2 world wars within a 30-year period. Ward doesn't go to the character assassination route that Derrick Jensen takes in Endgame, but unlike Ward, Derrick does also refer to the years of violent resistance within India as another cause for independence. Referring to Martin Luther King Jr., Ward states, "The limited successes attained by Martin Luther King and his disciples in the United States during the 1960s, using a strategy consciously guided by Gandhian principles of nonviolence, owes a considerable debt to the existence of less pacifist circumstances." Ward is arguing that King's success was not due to successful nonviolent tactics as much as it was due to being the lesser of 2 evils when compared to the more militant and social justice conscious Black Panther Party. Ward concludes, "Pacifist praxis, if followed to its logical conclusions, leaves its adherents with but 2 possible outcomes to their line of action. 1, to render themselves perpetually ineffectual, and consequently unthreatening in the face of state power, in which case they will likely be largely ignored by the status quo and self-eliminating in terms of revolutionary potential. Or 2, to make themselves a clear and apparent danger to the state, in which case they are subject to physical liquidation by the status quo and are self-eliminating in terms of revolutionary potential." The lesson is, if your pacifist protest is ineffective, like say the Iraq war protests, then you're simply ignored. And if you are slightly effective, like perhaps the Occupy movement, then you're dealt with by force and your message if reported, is distorted beyond recognition. The comfort zone. Ward Churchill goes on to talk about how pacifism, if done correctly, incurs risk and sacrifice, which is what makes the act so powerful. Ward takes one of the most extreme examples, the various people who set themselves aflame to protest the Vietnam War. Ward argues that these acts, though brave and incurring great sacrifice, had no effect on the war. And to be honest, my opinion is somewhat split on this analysis. Sure, Ward is right, more troops were stationed in Vietnam after the suicide protest, but perhaps more were sent because, and I believe it was Ben Franklin who argued this point, if 8% of the troops become ineffective, maybe deeply affected by the suicide protests, now you need a percentage of the armed forces to make up their shortage. And you need another percentage of the armed forces to discourage mutiny, and yet another percentage to run internal security. And so what looks like ramping up of forces might be ramping up the war in the face of protests, or it might be the system trying desperately to maintain itself. But perhaps the most disturbing lesson here is that even someone setting themselves on fire, one of the universally most feared experiences as a means of protest, could not bring the war to a halt. Other admirable examples Ward gives is people chaining themselves or otherwise blocking and stopping the processes they are protesting, such as Earth First, or the Plowshares, whose acts are very different from standing in a public area with a picket sign. As Ward puts it, American activism has not been the truly pacifist formation. How can we forge a revolutionary politics within which we can avoid inflicting violence on others? On the contrary, a more accurate guiding question has been, what sort of politics might I engage in which with both allow me to posture as a progressive and allow me to avoid incurring harm to myself. Hence, the trappings of pacifism have been subverted to establish a sort of politics of the comfort zone. Ward goes on to detail the specifics of symbolic actions such as getting permits to hold demonstrations, refusing to disperse, getting arrested and charged with trespassing or being a public nuisance, then paying a fine and going home. Ward then compares this trivial style of protest to the mass violence and injustice of what is being protested. For example, a protest against U.S. foreign policy, the best display of opposition to our government killing tens or hundreds of thousands of people in another country, is a group of people, perhaps in a public square, holding some cardboard signs, maybe shouting some slogans, and then dispersing when asked. Let's pretend. In this section, Ward attempts to examine several salient claims still extended by pacifist organizers. For example, one of these claims is that the nonviolent mass movement against the war, Vietnam, forced Lyndon Johnson from office when he failed to withdraw from Vietnam. Actually, as has been conclusively demonstrated, it was hawks rather than doves who toppled Johnson. This was due to the perceived ineffectiveness with which he prosecuted the war, brought about not by pacifist parades in American streets, but by the effectiveness of Vietnamese armed resistance to the U.S. military. Basically, like the arguments against Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi single-handedly creating change, here Ward does the same thing for the anti-Vietnam War movement. The buck is passed. This section is summarized by Ward stating, it is immediately perplexing to confront the fact that many of North America's most outspoken advocates of absolute domestic nonviolence when challenging state power have consequently aligned themselves with the most powerful expressions of armed resistance to the exercise of U.S. power abroad. For example, Vietnam protesters might have carried a Viet Cong flag in sympathy and solidarity with their struggle for liberation, but carrying the flag was as far as it went. Ward concludes, North American adherents to nonviolence are intended to win regardless of outcome. The comfort zone of white skin privilege is to be continued in either event. Here Ward is essentially charging that the typical white dogmatic pacifist protester wants to have solidarity with the oppressed and exploited groups they have compassion for, but they are unwilling to do anything that might affect their access to the perks, benefits, and comforts of the status quo. Profile of a pathology. Ward breaks pacifism down into defined sections, firstly saying pacifism is delusional. Ward argues that when pacifists claim by remaining nonviolent pacifism can morally compel the state to respond in kind must be considered a deep-seated and persistent delusion. I think this is half right. A, many times peaceful protests are responded to with violence. B, the state responding violently to pacifists is the whole point, because it shocks and enrages people into distrusting the government and makes the pacifist views more agreeable. Sadly, though, this isn't true. In the past, seeing pacifists attacked by fire hoses and dogs was enough to outrage people into demanding Civil Rights Act, but I would argue that nowadays protests involve pepper spray, clubs, and other weapons of crowd control, and if the protest does get any attention, the response is a disapproving shrug at best, and at worst, sympathetic understanding to the police action. Ward concludes that pacifism is racist, and that pacifism is suicidal. Toward a liberatory praxis. This section starts with Ward looking at Marx, Hegel, and other thinkers' definition of praxis, and Ward comes away with the following. Praxis might be accurately defined as action consciously and intentionally guided by theory, while simultaneously guiding the evolution of theoretical elaboration. Basically, praxis is more accurate than practice because praxis implies changing and adapting as the action continues. Ward then explains the value in using a variety of tactics. Following many of the arguments laid down by the mini manual of the urban guerrilla, Ward concludes, any revolutionary movement within advanced capitalist nations must develop the broadest possible range of thinking action by which to confront the state. A therapeutic approach to pacifism. Ward argues that the best argument against dogmatic pacifism is therapeutic. He gives a step-by-step practice for confronting dogmatic pacifism and coming out on the other side with a better understanding of the pacifist position, or perhaps a change in position. First, values clarification. With this, Ward argues that when values are clarified, then dogmatic pacifists will ultimately either conclude that they don't really want big changes in the status quo, or that pacifism is insufficient for achieving their goals of transforming the status quo. Ward seems to hope this process will reveal the contradictions in pacifism that he and Derrick Jensen and others have expressed. Step 2, reality therapy. Here Ward argues that dogmatic pacifists should live amongst the most neglected populations in the country. He states, the reality of existing in perpetual physical jeopardy and or of being physically abused in an extreme fashion precisely because of being unwanted, especially on racial grounds, while living in the most squalid of conditions is precisely what must be understood by self-proclaimed revolutionaries, pacifists, or otherwise. Avoiding direct encounters with these circumstances as well as knowledge of them is to avoid revolutionary reality in favor of the comfort zone. Essentially, that to pacifists, violence is a philosophical question, but to live where violence is a constant reality takes it out of that realm of pure, comfortable philosophy and into the realm of lived experience. Third, evaluation. This step is essentially values clarification again, and Ward concludes that after living with neglected populations, some participants will decide that they don't really want big changes in the status quo, and others will increase solidarity with the neglected populations through lived experience. Fourth, demystification. Ward's argument here is simple. Many people on the left view firearms and other weapons with fear and or disgust and learn nothing about them. Essentially that it doesn't serve the movement well when riot police come at them with rubber bullets, flashbangs, etc., and the entire movement has little to no knowledge about the function and mechanics of these weapons. With this training, Ward argues, pacifism can be chosen as a tactical option rather than a default choice made by lack of options. And lastly, reevaluation. This step is essentially values clarification and evaluation again, basically a chance for participants to think about what they want, what they've learned in the training, and to go from there. Conclusion. Ward summarizes his book stating, in concluding, I would at last like to state the essential premise of this essay clearly. The desire for a non-violent and cooperative world is the healthiest of all psychological manifestations. This is the overarching principle of liberation and revolution. Undoubtedly, it seems the highest order of contradiction that, in order to achieve nonviolence, we must first break with it in overcoming its root causes. Therein, however, lies our only hope. Essentially arguing that the ends justify the means, that we want a world where pacifist protest is successful, but as long as pacifism is an unsuccessful tactic, we might need to fight to make that world a reality. On Ward Churchill's Pacifism as Pathology, Toward a Revolutionary Practice by Mike Ryan. Here, rather than addressing Ward's Pacifism as Pathology directly, Mike names his own arguments for nonviolence to critique. 1. There is the ever-popular assertion that the time is not right. 2. It is intended that violence alienates people. 3. It is suggested that violence brings down repression. And 4. Lastly, we are told violence will get us bad press. Mike gives various reasons for why each argument is wrong. For example, in the argument that the time is not right, Mike asks, how bad do things have to be before we realize that we need to act now? The sooner the better. Which reminds me of both Derrick Jensen's argument that how bad do things have to be before we call it apocalypse, and also Slavoj Žižek's argument that the time will never be right, because if we don't act, it's because the time's not right, and once we do act, we realize that we should have acted sooner. Mike concludes, as long as we remain passive and ineffective in our resistance, we will, as Ward Churchill states, leave third and fourth world peoples in the front line of a very real and very violent struggle between imperialism and liberation, while we continue to reap the benefits of a comfort zone created by their oppression. Mike makes the argument that Martin Luther King Jr. style nonviolent protests only work when large sections of the population are uninformed of the problems raised, and the state's crushing of the protests serves to cause alarm and a call for change. With corporate politics and corporate media, this method is ineffective. The state establishes the type of protest to take place by its reaction to the protest. When peaceful protest is responded with tear gas, clubs, mace, and a total lack of reform, then the state has told the movement that pacifist protest is ineffective. Mike then gives a brief history and quotes from leading anti-imperialist groups within the U.S., such as the Young Lords, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, etc. He then explains that violence against oppression in the Third World is seen as more acceptable because their conditions are more dire. This is similar to Ward's argument earlier, but Mike concludes the same sort of third and fourth world circumstances and dynamics exist within the contemporary borders of the United States and Canada, as the militarization of police in the ghettos and the frequent shooting of unarmed civilians can attest to. Mike concludes, in sum, we must recognize the validity of violence as a necessary step in self-defense and toward liberation, when the violence of the system leaves the victims with no other viable option. As Slavoj Žižek argues, yes, break windows, but also say you wish that you didn't have to. Or as Derrick Jensen argues, if you are unwilling to participate in the violence that needs to be done to create the changes that need to be made, you should at least have the human decency to get out of the way. To finish my analysis, I want to explain how this text changed how I think. One lesson I learned from this text is that the discussions surrounding violence and nonviolent protests suffer the same problem as many two-sided arguments in America. If you believe A, you are automatically assumed to completely disagree with B, and vice versa. Yet Ward and several other thinkers are simply arguing that you should assess the situation, respond in what way will be most effective. If you are protesting City Hall, showing up with guns is ineffective. But at the same time, walking around a public square with a sign protesting deforestation occurring hundreds of miles away will also get you nowhere. There are other examples given above. I would say that the biggest lesson I learned from this text, though, is that movements don't take place in a vacuum. I had been raised thinking that Gandhi had stopped English imperialism, that Martin Luther King Jr. had brought about civil rights, and that Vietnam War protesters had stopped the Vietnam War. But all of these changes had active and often violent protagonists at its head. In the end, the answer doesn't seem to be, should the protest be violent or nonviolent, but rather, what action will be most effective for the change that is needed. If you are interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical book reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.